Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
Recently, I went to a screening of Shyam Benegal's landmark 1976 film Manthan, about the beginnings of the dairy cooperative movement in India. The lead character in there is modeled after Dr. Verghese Kurian, the father of India's White Revolution. And movingly, long before we were talking about crowdfunding, the film tells us it was funded by dairy farmers themselves. 5 lakh farmers gave 2 rupees each. At the screening, Nasiruddin Shah said in those days, 10 lakhs was enough to get a film like Manthan made. Dr. Kurian lobbied hard to win subsidies for the dairy industry, and now India has the largest dairy herd in the world. But what distinguishes India from the rest of the world is the cow is not just the giver of milk, it is a sacred animal for millions of Indians. Many states have laws against cow slaughter, and that poses a curious conundrum for India. What do we do with all those cows? And even as Indians call her mother cow, does the cow really want to be mother to anyone other than her own calves? A new book goes deep into the world of Indian dairy to figure out the dilemma this poses and the stories we don't like to think about as we pour milk into our coffee. The book is Mother Cow, Mother India, a multi-species politics of dairy in India. And its author is Yamini Narayanan, who joins us from Australia, where she is senior lecturer in international and community development at Deakin University. Yamini Narayanan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Sandip. I really appreciate being here.
It's the fact that the dairy industry the world over treats its cows problematically, to say the least. It has been the focus of many articles, exposés. It's known, even if it's ignored, perhaps. But what makes the dairy industry in India different from its counterparts around the world?
That's a great question. So the Indian dairy industry has a lot of distinguishing features, both purely in terms of production and also in terms of the symbolism associated with the cow as well as the milk. So just in terms of production, the economic scale of the dairy industry, India has the largest dairy herd in the world. India has been the largest dairy producer since 1997, a position that it has held on to steadfastly, like it has not really ever changed. So it has always been the number one leading dairy producer for now close to 25, 30 years. In terms of scale, it is the largest dairy herd in the world. What also distinguishes the dairy industry in India, though, is the extraordinary political symbolism that's bestowed upon the cow. India's dairy industry per se also composes buffaloes, camel, goat, sheep. So there's a whole spectrum of animals. But of course, cows are one of the most represented species. And there is this profusely political symbolism that's associated with the cow in India. The Constitution of India, in its directive principles of state policy, basically directs the states. It cannot command the states, but it does direct the state to prohibit cow slaughter. And most states in India have interpreted this in various ways. Now, what this basically means is that it actually has direct connotations for the dairy industry, because what we don't often realize, and it's not just in India, but I think globally, we don't normally associate the dairy industry or the egg industries for that matter with slaughter, because these animals are still alive. They need to be alive for extraction, right? So because they need to be alive, these industries are not normally associated with slaughter in the same way that meat industries are, because meat industries require the animal to be slaughtered, whereas here you require the animal to be alive and then be slaughtered when it is no longer productive. So slaughter is very much a strong component of any animal-based industry. Once they're no longer productive, whatever the product is, whether it is dairy or eggs, the animals do get slaughtered, right? But this fact is disassociated. And every productive, economically viable dairy industry does have to slaughter its unproductive animals. In India, though, because of the slaughter prohibition, what basically happens is that this becomes the slaughter continuum, because dairy production starts with breeding the animals, impregnating them, making them go through repeated cycles of pregnancies if they're female, and then eventually the continuum moves on towards abattoirs, towards butcher houses, etc. And that's a really significant component of dairy production. And that component of dairy production, what is interesting in India is that it is disassociated from dairy. Instead, it is associated with beef, a commodity that India actually doesn't produce as a primary product. And number two, we somehow carry on in populist discourse as though it is possible to have a productive, economically viable dairy industry without slaughtering animals. And it's not.
So, which leads to the question, since that's the case, how do the other animals that you talked about, whose milk is also consumed, the buffalo, the goat, and even the camel, but on whom there is not this sort of slaughter ban that is there on the cow, for example, how are those animals treated? Like how is their fate and their condition different as compared to cows?
There isn't fundamentally a difference because at the end of the day, all of the animals do get slaughtered. It is just that there is no political controversy or concern necessarily associated with the other animals. So there is to some extent with buffaloes. Certainly there is now with camels. The state of Rajasthan has pretty much enacted very similar laws to cow protection. Like there are camel protection laws in place in Rajasthan. Camel is now declared a state animal of Rajasthan. Rajasthan is doing the exact same thing that India as a state is doing, which is invest heavily in camel dairy production, but the slaughter of camels is banned. And it's also not allowed to take camels out of the sort of physical boundaries of Rajasthan. So what happens in the case of camels or cows is that they will be trafficked. So all animals get transported to the slaughterhouse. That just has to happen. Except that what happens in the case of camels or in the case of cows is that it happens in the informal economy, it happens in the black economy, and it happens underground. And this aspect of dairy production alone is heavily politicized in the case of cows. It's basically Muslims and Dalits who are seen as, uniquely butchering cows, and they are seen as responsible for cow slaughter, whereas butchers in general, the slaughter industry in general, if you look at the people, the workers who are actually engaged in slaughter work, just about in any country in the world, these are usually the most vulnerable and the poorest segments of the population. So if you look at the United States, for example, they are oftentimes undocumented migrants, illegal migrants, and they work in these situations just because there is absolutely no other option. And if you look at India, it is no different. Like the political economy of slaughter per se, the dirty labor, so to speak, of slaughtering is done by the poorest and the most vulnerable and the most precarious. And these happen to be, not just happen to me, but these are Muslims and Dalits in the case in India. But this becomes politicized as though this is something that is being done as an attack on a sacred Hindu animal, on a sacred Hindu symbol, and basically on the aspirational Hindu state itself. So Mother Cow and Mother India are basically indistinguishable in the vision of Hindu nationalism, in the populist sort of narratives of Hindu nationalism.
But Yamini, does that also have the reverse problem? I have seen these slogans where people say, "Je suis steak eater." I am a steak eater, almost as a way of saying that is a way I am standing up for the Dalits and Muslims who are being attacked by the right-wing forces. So in some weird way, that's equally problematic.
Showing solidarity to Muslims and Dalits is of utmost importance. And I will start by absolutely being emphatic about this because exclusionary politics is so essential to any form of authoritarian, conservative nationalism. It's important to nationalism per se, but it takes on particularly violent forms under authoritarian rule. And it's extraordinary and profound violence and has been ongoing for decades and has culminated into something almost unseen through the specific use of the cow body in the last 10 years. Showing solidarity is crucial. But when we show solidarity through beef consumption, there is a few things that absolutely get missed here. And inadvertently, we are actually reinforcing the symbolism of beef as a marker that is, as a product that becomes associated with Muslims and Dalits. Now, India's primary bovine industry is dairy. We don't produce beef in India. Beef is a byproduct of dairying in India. If you look at other leading beef countries, like, for example, Australia, Argentina, Brazil, United States, they actually have cows that are reared for beef. We have cows in India that are exclusively for dairy. So the Gir, Jersey, Holstein, Sahiwal, any of these breeds, they're all dairying breeds. They're all high lactating breeds. We don't actually have beef breed cows in India. Beef breed cows have a whole different set of genetics. They have double muscular, bodily sort of formations. They are reared in a way that is actually for beef consumption, right? They're bred for beef consumption. We don't have these kind of breeds in India at all. So we breed cows for dairying. Everything else that we get from cows or from bovines in general are a byproduct, including beef. And I've spent so much time talking to Muslims and Dalits about, is beef per se significant in your cultures? And the answer has always been no. It's been made significant. Like beef fundamentally is no more meaningful than mutton or chicken or any other meat, right? Or fish or whatever. It's not particularly meaningful at all, but it's been made meaningful. And this is something that Mahatma Gandhi had talked about way back as well, because if beef is going to be weaponized against them, then of course beef also becomes weaponized back as a mode of resistance. Now, when we consume beef to show solidarity, it is basically reinforcing, playing into the hands of Hindu nationalistic politics, which has made beef profusely symbolic as a product that is associated with Muslims and Dalits, right? So showing solidarity in this way actually reinforces a really incorrect association of Muslims, Dalits, beef. This interconnection is a constructed one. There is no historical, cultural connection between Muslims, Dalits, and beef. It's been created. And by showing solidarity through consuming beef, you're actually reinforcing and strengthening this interconnection. However, there is actually an interconnection between Hindus and dairy, right? There is no Hindu ritual that can be conducted without butter, ghee, milk, etc. Milk has a profuse symbolism in so many Hindu mythologies, starting from Krishna, starting from the stories around the ocean of milk. Milk has profound symbolism in Hinduism. But then we obfuscate that. Like the primary product for which cows are reared in India is milk. Milk is a slaughter industry. Milk is associated with Hindu cultures and Hindu religion, but we are completely silent about this. This interconnection actually exists, but the beef Muslim and Dalit interconnection does not exist. It's a constructed one.
Have you then seen any kind of alliances between, say, Dalits and animal rights movements, who are often accused of inadvertently playing into a Hindutva ideology?
There are a lot of Dalit vegans and Dalit animal rights activists. Animal rights activism, it's a multicultural space. It really is a multicultural, multi-class space. I was amazed throughout my time I've been working on animal issues, animal politics for over a decade now. And outside looking in, it's always framed and presented as this upper class, elite urban woman sort of, type of activism. And that could not be further from the case, right? And I have seen the spectrum of people who put themselves on the front lines will oftentimes come from the most marginalized strata of society. So this is actually a really multi-class, multi-caste, multi-religious space. In Indian animal activism is a landscape which is really sort of united, I think, by a recognition of what animals actually endure. Over the last few years, I've come to realize that it's not that people think that animals are not important and that's why they're not interested. I actually think it's that, they're afraid that they'll care too much. The profound animal suffering that people witness, it's not something that is easy to turn away from. This is not purely a religious or a caste issue. I think it is about once you land your gaze on what animals endure, and once you bear witness, and once there is that sort of intimate eye contact. Naisargi Dave talks about this very, very beautifully in her book. Once there's some type of an interchange between you and the animal that is suffering, it's really hard to walk away from it.
What was that point of interchange for you, Yamini? Because you've written that, you grew up vegetarian. But obviously, at some point, this interchange happened where you moved beyond what you grew up with.
I think social media initially, right at the very outset, social media had a lot to do with it, because when I was on Facebook, and this was several years ago now, a friend kept sharing posts from PETA, India, and she was the only one who was sharing animal-based posts. I noticed it, but at one point she shared a post of a rabbit screaming. So this was an Angora, wool farm in China, where the method of extraction is that they quite literally rip the fur off living rabbits. We had a couple of rabbits as pets growing up, and I had not known that a rabbit could make a sound like that kind of scream from the pain. And then usually what happens in Angora factories is that, you rip the fur from living rabbits, and then 3 months later, when the fur is grown back, you do the same thing again. And of course, at the end of once the rabbit is too weak, too emaciated, they also get sent to the slaughterhouse. But I had never ever heard a rabbit scream. I didn't know that they were capable of making that kind of sound. It was bone chilling. And that was when I clicked on Peter's video, Peter's page myself. And then, of course, an entire world opens. It's not just PETA. I mean, it's an entire world of animal NGOs and animal rescue shelters and animal protection organizations and animal people and individuals who are working on different aspects of animal welfare. I started speaking with Pradeep Kumar Nath, who heads the Vishaka Society for the Protection and Care of Animals in Vishakhapatnam. He was incredibly patient in answering a lot of my questions. It was visceral and it was difficult to turn away from. Once you come to know, once you see, you can't unsee and you can't unknow, right? I'm a Tamilian Brahmin woman, and a lot of people during the course of my research thought, oh, I'm looking at cows because, I have this sort of Hindu nationalistic agenda myself. I spoke to Pradeep for over several days where he told me stories of animals of the one type of species after another, monkeys, cobras, goats. I mean, the list was endless, emus. And I said, what do I do? Like, which animal shall I focus on? And he said, do the cows. Even we find it really hard to understand what is going on. Is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? This kind of massive attention that is now suddenly laser focused on the cow. And to go back to something that you had raised earlier, that animal activists are often rightly or wrongly seen as Hindutva supporters. It's really interesting because when it comes to the cow, any animal activist will tell you, in general, by the way, that it is so incredibly difficult to achieve any type of win for the animals. It is so hard. It is so hard to get people to care. It is so hard to get people to know, understand, respond. It is so difficult to change laws. And suddenly, just in India alone, you actually have a law that protects cows. And they're like, well, of course we're going to use it, right? But then, of course, the law was never made in the interests of animals. The law was made in the interest of creating and preserving a Hindu state. So it was never about the cows. It was always about nationalism. But when you're talking to an animal activist on the ground who's just beaten down and has, a huge number of demands on their time constantly witnessing direct suffering, and, they're able to at least access some type of protection for at least one animal, they tend to use it, right? And oftentimes they also will stop trucks and, get the animals off because that's one species for whom they can actually go to the courts for.
Do something because there is a law.
There is a law in place
that they can use.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things you mentioned earlier, struck me where you stressed that countries like US and Australia have cows that are specifically raised to produce beef, so that genetically they have more meat, more muscle, whatever.
Yes.
India doesn't.
Yes.
Even though India is one of the world's largest beef exporters, but these are, I guess, the beef that's coming from spent dairy cows. So what is the implication of that for the cow itself, in the cows in India, that our cows were never meant for beef, but, end of the byproduct is beef?
Yeah. Look, I mean, once an animal is slaughtered, how you use their body it's not directly, immediately relevant. But what is important here is that now India produces one of the largest volumes of beef in the world. In 2014, it became the leading producer. Since then, it's always been amongst the top 3 or top 5 leading producers. The beef that is exported is largely from buffalo beef, because I've been to a lot of export-oriented slaughterhouses, and based on the ones that I've visited, and I think this would be true across the board, there is such a huge amount of risk in allowing cows to be slaughtered in export-oriented slaughterhouses that it's economically not even worth the risk.
So where do the cows go?
Very broadly, it's possible to think about 3 types of slaughterhouses that work in India. And one is the export-oriented, licensed, mechanized slaughterhouses. That's all intended for export. Then you have the municipal slaughterhouses that are state-run, right? And now they also need to abide, technically speaking, by the laws of the state. But it is not uncommon at all to find cows in the bovine section of all these different slaughterhouses, of these municipal slaughterhouses. Slaughterhouses are almost spaces of like some type of, they tend to call them like mafia spaces, where it's really difficult to file a case or even sort of enter, witness, take photos, etc. It's really difficult. Like activists try to do this all the time and at great risk to themselves. And the only states where you can openly see cows being slaughtered it's very easy to see that in West Bengal and in Kerala, which do not have cow slaughter laws. So there you do actually have licensed, authorized municipal cow slaughterhouses, which are uncommon in the rest of India. Where cows mostly get slaughtered are the backyard, underground, shadow slaughterhouses, which might be, slaughtering about 2 to 5 cows at a time, which is very much the nature of informal economies. They tend to be that tiny in scale, single person units, and they tend to be pretty much throughout the country. And there are also regions which are like entire slaughter regions. Dindigul, which is in Tamil Nadu, and it's very close to the Tamil Nadu-Kerala border. Tamil Nadu does have cow protection laws, and slaughter is prohibited. But in Dindigul, there are any number of informal slaughterhouses because it is easy to then transport the beef to Kerala, which is a high beef consuming state. So this happens all the time. And it's not just the transportation of cows to slaughterhouses, it's also the transportation of beef. That also carries a lot of risk. So these also tend to go throughout the country. So, if you look at your export-oriented slaughterhouses, they all have these nice refrigerated trucks and, having to abide by public health laws because that is required in order for it to be an export product. Whereas when it comes to your illegal slaughterhouses, oftentimes it is either sold pretty much on the day. So, they call them wet markets, or sometimes they're actually transported to different states and they can actually spend 3-4 days in unrefrigerated trucks.
One of the really fascinating things about the book, Yamini, is the amount of field work you actually did, the places you went to, which most of us have never seen or heard of. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about, what those places feel like. So, for example, you go to a bovine semen farm. So what is a bovine semen farm like? What happens there?
So a bovine semen farm usually houses what they call elite bulls, genetically elite bulls, who are capable of producing high lactating daughters. So if you go to a dairy farm, the cows are emaciated, the cows are, streaked with their own dung and urine, they're lying in their own feces. Oftentimes dairy farms can be filthy. Bovine semen farms, on the other hand, contain animals who are magnificent because they are at the prime of their youth. They are young virile males because, it's the young males that tend to have the highest quality semen. And twice a day, they are what in laboratory terms, they're actually milked for semen. So basically these bulls are made to sort of basically ejaculate into a artificial vagina. And that semen then...
Let me stop you there. I mean, it's a bull. How are they excited enough to ejaculate?
Yeah.
There's no cow porn or something going on here.
No, that's a really good question. So what happens is that they are trained to mount this dummy cow as early as 5 months, 6 months. I've seen bull calves being trained that early to mount the dummy cow. The veterinary assistant or the scientific assistant there makes this kind of like whistling sound, which apparently arouses the bulls, and they basically ejaculate. It takes minutes, and they ejaculate into the artificial vagina, which is again a temperature-controlled artificial vagina created to sort of replicate a real cow vagina. They collect the semen, and then it's sort of pushed into the laboratory window. From there on, they package them into straws. One bull can actually father like thousands upon thousands upon thousands of calves after he's dead as well. Because what they do with the semen is that they will basically freeze it. So if it's an elite bull, you want him to ejaculate as much as possible. So his semen is stored for decades to come if needed. And this frozen semen is also an export product. So we will get frozen semen from elite bulls in the United States or Europe, and we will also send frozen semen from India. So it's actually quite ironical when we talk about cow protection in India and then we send, semen around the world where slaughter is very much allowed. It kind of loses meaning in all of these transnational exchanges. So these bulls are usually kept in the bovine semen farms for about 6-7 years, and after 6-7 years, they'll all be sent to the slaughterhouse as well. It's really interesting because these bulls cannot be actually even sent to a gaushala because they have had no contact with females. They have had no contact with herds. So they tend to be solitary. They have no understanding of how to interact in a herd. They have no understanding of how to interact with each other. They live basically in stalls alone, oftentimes. So they are so incapable of integration into a herd that they can't even be sent to gaushalas. So these bulls all basically end up in slaughterhouses. And in fact, in all of my travels, I think I found one bull in a Pinjarapole in Ahmedabad. who was integrated. And that was only because he was extremely timid.
I want to get to the goshalas, but before that, there is the actual dairy farm or tabelas. I remember years ago, even the Congress party actually, it's before the hand symbol, its symbol was a mother cow and a calf suckling, right? That was like
Yes.
the ultimate symbol of motherhood,
Yes.
the cow and the calf. And you write in the book that actually what we don't think about is that mother child estrangement is the heart of daring. Can you talk about that?
Yes, it's extraordinarily ironical, profoundly ironical in India that we celebrate the cow as a mother while devastating her own biological bonds, psychological bonds, emotional bonds with her own biological progeny. And cows tend to be as fierce, passionate, loving mothers as any other species. I mean, mothers of any species are hardwired to protect their young. And what happens, the dairy industry can only function by disrupting this bond. I think on the first day of birth, or sometimes immediately after birth, and these cows will bellow and cry for the calves. But equally, the calves themselves are so disoriented, so lost without the mother. I mean, in the case of cows, in the case of females, adult cows will try and suckle from each other because they never had that opportunity and they're constantly looking for a mother. And of course, if the calf is male, then the calf is routed to the slaughterhouse. The dairy industry can only survive by violating the mother-child bond, which is true everywhere in the world. Of course, in India, it becomes extra ironical because we tend to celebrate the cow as the mother. And this is one of the points that I want to make, that I make in my book, is that our framing of the cow as mother is one of profound domination. It's a way of dominating the cow because it's not a consensual relationship, right? It's the cow never consented to be our mother because the minute we say you are our mother, the first birthright of a child from its mother is lactation, is milk.
But we've also been sort of taught to believe, especially with this sort of Kamdhenu model of the cow, that the cow produces so much milk that it keeps coming so much that, really it's way more than the calf needs. And so we are also partaking of the milk. So we don't really think about it as that deprivation model you're talking about.
Yeah, and that is not actually a natural phenomenon of milk production. Cows have been bred to over-lactate. Like some breeds of cows produce, like the Holstein breed, produces about 40 to 60 liters of milk per day. The closest that we have for a wild cow now in terms of lactation are the beef breed cows. And a beef breed cow, for example, will only lactate about 7-8 liters when the calf is born, and then it actually tapers off. It becomes like, 3-4 liters as the calf grows older and starts eating solids, same as how it occurs with human women. Whereas dairy breeds have actually been bred. That's what happens. That's what I meant by elite bulls who are genetically elite because they're capable of siring high lactating daughters. So it's not a natural phenomenon that cows produce a lot of milk. They've been made to produce a lot of milk. And this actually takes a huge, huge toll on the body. Milk production is a calorie-intensive job. Like you can ask any breastfeeding woman, for example, about the state of metabolic hunger, right? Because they're constantly hungry because milk production is such a calorie-intensive job. Egg laying is a calorie-intensive job because the body is working so hard, right? So it takes a huge toll on the body. After 2 or 3 pregnancies, the cows are emaciated because the bodies aren't capable of, first of all, sustaining pregnancies, but even more than sustaining pregnancy, or at least as much as sustaining pregnancy, they have to sustain and endure huge amounts of lactation, of milk production. A cow would normally produce about 4 or 5 liters of milk, more or less enough to meet the needs of the calf. And it would never be anywhere near 40, 50 liters. So that in itself is actually a profound violence to the cow.
So when we have these cows like the Holsteins or Jerseys, which are known to produce, are been genetically engineered to produce these enormous quantities of milk, which is what we want, then how come instead of venerating these high milk producing cows, you discover that at the end, these cows are not even allowed into goshalas because they are not Indian?
Yeah. Exactly. So this is, again, our way in India of trying to navigate the economic realities of milk production. Because in India, you're not allowed to slaughter these spent animals, right? You're not allowed to dispose them off the way that you would in any other dairy producing country. So you now have to try and find ways of rationalizing disposal. Article 48 does not specify any particular breed of cows. They just say that, they only recommend that cows, bulls, calves, etc., not be slaughtered. This is just our way of trying to rationalize some way of disposing of some of these cows. So one easy way is that the gaushalas will only take Indian breed cows. And of course, the gaushalas get filled up very quickly as well. So it's not even that all Indian breed cows can never be saved. And once in the gaushala, they're just tied for life, basically. So that's another kind of miserable existence. But the way that, a lot of gaushalas and a lot of Hindu nationalists as well will rationalize disposal of cows is basically by saying they are not even cows. So I've heard so many people tell me that Holsteins and Jerseys are not even cows. Culturally, if I can conceptualize of these cows as not even cows, because they're not Indian, they're American, and American cows are not as sacred as Indian cows, or that these artificial, the reason why we breed them, that itself becomes a reason to demonize them. These are human constructed cows. We have bred them. God didn't breed them. So this just becomes a sort of cultural, political way of trying to rationalize sending some of these cows to slaughter.
So one of the things that you also mentioned in the section about where you go to the dairy farms, which I was absolutely unaware of, is this practice called kal bacha, right? And I wanted you to talk a bit about what that entails and also how commonplace is it?
Kal bachas are extremely common in virtually every dairy farm everywhere in the country. And they are most common with buffaloes as well as with the Indian breed cows. So kal bacha is basically a taxidermied calf. So once the calf has been butchered, they will basically taxidermy the calf. It's a crude taxidermy, stuff the calf. And the reason is that buffaloes as well as Indian breed cows, typically, because they haven't been bred as much, because they haven't been selectively bred to the extent of, like the other cows, like the Holsteins, like the Jerseys, like the Swiss Guernsey, like these cows have been bred by us, and so they tend to have easier milk let down. The buffaloes, for example, who have barely been bred to the same extent as cows, will not let down milk easily if the calf is not around. A mother will lactate spontaneously if the calf is nearby, or if the child or the infant is nearby. This is not merely physiological. It's a psychological, physiological, emotional interconnection, right? So what they do in dairy farms is use these taxidermied calves. They will place the taxidermied calves near the mother. So the mother thinks that this is her calf, and then she will allow milk let down. So it basically, I think, almost viscerally demonstrates just how important this mother-child bond is to the mother. So this actually is a really visceral sort of symbolism, but it's also visceral reality that shows the extent to which these animals suffer. And it also shows that we recognize that. We know exactly what's going on. We know exactly why she's agitated or in distress. And so, the way that they have tried to sort of address this is use taxidermied calves.
Well, another way people have tried to address some of these concerns is now you are seeing companies like Pride of Cows advertising about how much they care about their cows, that they get to roam free or listen to music. So especially as somebody who was raised as a vegetarian, having milk, is there an ethical way to consume milk, in your opinion? I mean, are there people say that, I get my milk from such and such free-range dairy farm where the calves are not deprived as much of milk?
Well, the simple answer is no, because the cow still goes through unwanted pregnancies, forcible pregnancies. Separation is inevitable. There is no dairy production without some level of separation. Even if the calf is allowed to be with the mother or consume some milk, at what point for how long can you do this? At what point do you have to draw a line and then revert to regular forms of dairying where you do have to end up separating the calf and the cow?
You, in fact, at this dairy farm, you beg someone to let this calf suckle.
Yeah.
I can't remember. How long did the calf eventually suckle for? I mean, typically they're allowed, a few seconds to get the milk flowing, a few minutes?
Exactly. So typically what happens is, either dairy farms will use kal bacha, or they'll actually keep some calves around, especially if male or female, they'll keep the calves around. for just a few seconds, they'll be allowed to suckle at milking time. Once the milk is let down, then they're dragged away immediately. So I was at a dairy farm during milking time, the afternoon milking time. And it was one of the most, in just about every way, it's one of the most sensorily hyper overstimulated experiences because the calves are screaming, the cows are screaming, the cows are screaming for the calves, bellowing for the calves. The calves who have been kept precisely for this purpose are also bellowing and screaming. Now, if you think about a human infant, basically suckles almost every hour. It is no different in the case of calves. They actually, if you let them, they would need to suckle every hour, right? But because of milking timings, which only happens twice a day, they are only allowed to suckle twice a day, and that too just for minutes. And if it's a male calf, that's all they get because they are not expected to live anyway. If it's a female calf, they might still get some formula, etc. If it's a male, that's all they get, right? And there was this one calf in a Visakhapatnam dairy farm. It was exceptionally loud. Like as soon as I entered the dairy farm, I could sort of hear this one particular resonant cry. And I thought it was a cow. I thought it was a cow in distress. And, eventually when we went to the calf, then I realized it came from this really tiny Jersey calf, right? And he was small, he was tiny, and he had this really loud yell. And he was actually being punished because he was yelling so much. So they said he's going to be the last to be fed. The thing about, being a worker in a dairy farm is not that they are inhumane. It's just that violence gets normalized. And that was just extremely distressing to see the calf's distress and his agitation. He was running from one end of the pen to the other. And, he every time they opened the gate to get another calf, he would run. And of course, they would push him back. And finally, I begged them. I said, please just let him suckle. So they let him go. And the cow that he ran towards, it wasn't his mother. It didn't matter. And the cow was trying to sniff him, lick him. She was tied, so she couldn't. And he started suckling her. And after a few minutes, the manager came and said, can I take him off now? Can I take him off now? And I said, no, please, just let him decide when to stop, right? Like for once in a dairy farm, let it be that the calf decides when it's enough. And he went on and on suckling, and I started to film it. And you wouldn't believe it. There were all these workers who came and gathered around me when we were all watching the calf suckle, because this was such an extraordinary sight in a dairy farm. Anyway, really, that a calf should be allowed to suckle from a cow. And ultimately, it took him about 27 minutes. He took 27 minutes. Now, I'm not saying that every calf takes 27 minutes. We don't know, right? And then he became very quiet after that. He was quite happy. And he was taken back to the pen. He just immediately curled down and went to sleep. And the tragedy was that in a couple of hours, he was going to start crying for milk again, because that's what babies do. And this was probably the one and only time he was ever going to get the comfort of a feed, not just the physiological comfort of having his hunger alleviated, but the psychological comfort. So this was a really stark experience for not just myself, but it was even for the workers in the farm. And after this was all over, I remember one of the workers, he was just a poor worker. He was just doing what he was told, but he was one of the few who came up to me and he quietly said, look, I'll try and give every calf as much time as possible. His gaze had also changed, and it's really important that the way that we see things gets disrupted. And this happens through various types of interactions. And it's sometimes good. It's actually important. When you are interfacing with violent systems, it's actually important to be outside of the system, because then you can actually see the violence much more clearly for what it is.
When you speak about gaze getting disrupted, was it disrupted for you, Yamini? Because you speak to a lot of the Gau Rakshaks, who are the vigilantes. Some people might think of them as heroes. Some people think of them as thugs. People have stereotypes about who is a Gau Rakshak and what they believe. Did meeting them disrupt your own ideas or perceptions about who Gau Rakshaks were and what motivates them?
It was very interesting meeting the cow vigilantes. Now, cow vigilantes, like any type of group, are not a homogeneous group, right? And it's also important to look at their motivations for entering this kind of, for engaging in this kind of political labor. At the end of the day, it's this political labor. And it's dirty political labor, because you're quite literally getting into physical altercations, which can be extremely violent. And of course, they also get beaten back. So it's quite literally difficult, physical, dirty labor. What is the motivation for cow vigilantes to come to this line of work? Terrorism studies will tell you a lot about motivations of people who are actually doing the groundwork, as opposed to those who are masterminding it. right? And even with cow vigilantism, what we don't really understand is that there is, and in my book, I talk about them as white collar vigilantes, the ones who are from the professional class, the ones who are actually masterminding the vigilantism that's actually taking place on the ground, that are actually training the people, sort of, providing them with the logistics and resources to do the kind of work that they do, etc. I've spoken to a lot of Gaurakshaks who were, what you might consider to be a stereotype. They were unemployed. They had nothing going for them before, they were sort of recruited into this kind of vigilantism. And suddenly they found a purpose in life, a noble purpose in life. And this became something that actually gave them meaning, gave them a sense of self. Saving the cow means saving the country. But there's also a huge number of vigilantes who I found were actually there for the animals. And a lot of them were not just, looking into saving cows, but they were also working with other animals. I met a cow vigilante in Ahmedabad who was very, very strident cow vigilante. And she would talk even, a lot of her Facebook posts would be worded in words of hate, etc., but was also doing a lot of animal protection work across other species like snakes and pigeons. And there was just no end, on the one hand, working as a typical animal activist might, but this became the platform for her to actually have the most structured sense of labor here, because there was support. There was a huge amount of support that, the parties pour into vigilantism, which animal activism hasn't per se consolidated in the same way.
So you had these long conversations with people who were in this. How did they understand or deny the simple mathematics of it, the arithmetic of the fact that all the cows that you are saving from who are being trafficked, that you, as for whatever reason, you're going there, you're putting yourself at risk to save these cows, but there's literally not enough space in gaushalas around the country to house all these cows. How do they square the math at the end? That, like, how will you have a no slaughter dairy economy if India were to impose a wholesale national ban on cow slaughter?
Yeah. So I would ask them, I said, what do you think is going to happen when you stop truck after truck and gaushalas fill up? And where will you take the other cows? Because some of them were already complaining about the fact that, this gaushala wouldn't accept it or that one wouldn't accept it. But they would also say, oh, but, there are these gaushalas now with, or that there's this one gaushala that has, space for 2,000 cows. And this other gaushala has space for 5,000 cows. Or, there's the Patmeda Gaushala in Rajasthan houses about 20,000 cows. And gaushalas during this period also started to house huge numbers of animals because they were getting funding in the way that they hadn't previously. Suddenly, since 2014, once cow vigilantism took off the way that it did, and all these cows started coming in larger numbers to the gaushalas, or gaushalas would just accept cows in large numbers, and then they would be mass underfeeding and starvation in the gaushalas. Hingonia Gaushala in Jaipur came under fire in 2016 when, there was a very public investigation where the cows were skeletal, absolutely skeletal, because they'd been starved for months and months, and the cows were just being dumped there. And then whatever rescued just means rescued from the slaughterhouse to be instead starved in the gaushala. So I would ask them these things, and they would say, oh, of course there's space and that's not an issue. And then you just probe further and further, and eventually some of them might accept that, yes, milk is a problem. But they were like, oh, okay, if milk is really the issue, then, well, what should we do? Like, we need to really rethink our consumption of milk. We need to come to terms with the fact that maybe we shouldn't be consuming milk. And that's a radical idea. And eventually it becomes also a very normalized idea. That's what happens when someone turns vegan. And, over the course of my research, I did become vegan.
That very moving story you told us about the calf that is allowed to suckle. It's a small moment of victory, of being able to do something for this animal. Did you just make you feel more helpless that you would keep seeing this, but there was so little you could do, whether at the dairy farm or at the slaughterhouse?
Yes. When I asked them to feed the calf, when I asked them to let the calf suckle, was I doing it for the calf or was I doing it for me? Yeah. Right? Because I found that sight so distressing and so unbearable. And what I would have really liked to do is just get the calf out of there. And of course, getting I take one calf out of there, I'm still leaving 15 other calves or 20 other calves or 40 or 50 other calves because of the scale. So there's this immediate sense of the helplessness is continuous, because in this research, what you're doing is constantly walking away from distress, right? So that one act, was it for him or was it for me? And I had to be brutally honest with myself, because some of it was for me, right? Because I found it so difficult to see. But at the same time, I think it also changed and shifted something in all of us. I'm not saying that the dairy farmer stopped his dairy operation or the workers left their job. None of that happened. But there was a shift in all of us, because there was a forcible realization in all of us that this is the truth of what should be happening. The truth of a cow lactating is that a calf suckles, not that we intervene with our milking machines. That's the unnatural bit. I think the hope is that we report on what we see and eventually try and facilitate some type of change. But that act of walking away became very difficult. One of the other ways in which I tried to sort of cope or help out was to, I started donating money to, some of the exceptionally fantastic charities and animal protection organizations and sanctuaries that I encountered through the course of my work. But the need to sort of really myself try and look after animals became very, very strong in me. And when I returned to Australia, the easiest thing for me to do in terms of rescuing a farmed animal was chickens, right? So my husband and I started to rescue some, provide a home for some rescued chickens rescued from the egg industry. And the egg industry, by the way, is very similar to the dairy industry in that it's, again, the exploitation of the female. Hens are bred to lay every day. Hens, chickens usually only lay about 12 times a year, as opposed to almost 300 to 365 days a year. And again, I had to ask that question, even though I was, in this case, I was actually brought the chickens home and I was looking after them myself. Am I doing it for them or am I doing it for me? And I think the answer is always going to be it's both.
And we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you for that honesty, though, Yamini. And thank you for joining us today, Yamini Narayanan.
Thank you so much for your time and your interest in this work. Thank you, Sandip.
Yamini Narayanan is an ARC Future Fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization. Her book, Mother Cow, Mother India, won the Mid-Career Researcher Book Prize 2024 from the Asian Studies Association of Australia and was shortlisted in the non-fiction category for the Crossword Book Awards 2024. Find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. Let us know what else you'd like to hear about on the show. Thanks, as always, for listening. And this show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.